Good afternoon, comrades. In a long-awaited move, the Cultural Commission of the IßiQuatscha People's Republic has announced in a landmark statement that the Creole language IßiQuatscha, also known as Quatsch, is set to be recognized as a co-official language, alongside isiXhosa, German, Khoikhoi, and Sesotho by the end of the year. The announcement was made as part of a campaign by the Southeast African People's Organization government to improve recognition for the minority cultures and languages of the Republic. Chief spokesperson of the IßiQuatscha advocacy group Feuerwehrza IßiQuatscha, Friedrich Ndlovu, said, "Abagamainshatsa bage isinchaidungu, abagamainshatsa bakwacha chehenda ekrisa fuya, isinchaidungu ikultuhu komisiono izaini ubuntu, amakrasa bage ulochahaha, amakrasa makoloniala unapaiti gesunta kabale fuya, iso yatsentalang uchahaha lesunzeya tuchanta, ulachahaha bage emakratsa, uchiahungu bage isinjerita, uchiagahungu eyuntanema fuya yetse isinshirita sinete, ukiakena inhola ge ngakrioli isunzeya ekampani ngarehetikait ubuntu, abagamainshata bage isinchaidungu." The Quatcha language is a Creole language dating back to the early days of German colonization in IßiQuatscha. German settlers arriving in the area brought both their religion and language. In their attempts to convert the indigenous IßiQuatscha to Christianity, many indigenous people were taught to read and write in German. As the settlers began to displace the IßiQuatscha from their lands and force them into labor on German plantations, the economic incentive to learn the colonizers' language grew. As with most cases of Creole genesis, the IßiQuatscha did not speak German exactly like their overlords from Hamburg or Frankfurt, and many linguistic features of their mother tongue remained as they tried learning the colonizers' language. One of the most recognizable examples of this is Quatcha's phonology. German's consonant coders and consonant clusters had to go, and vowels were appended at the ends of words and in between many consonant clusters to turn them into open syllables. German's voiceless uvular fricative became a velar fricative, and clusters including a velar plosive and voiced velar fricative became a velar affricate. The schwa and near-open central vowels both became a, and the umlaut vowels u and ö and their long equivalents all shifted to e and e respectively. The other vowels shifted to their closest isiXhosa equivalent, and there remained a distinction between long and short vowels. All coda fricatives were also dropped, and the palatal fricative h became the glottal fricative ha into vocalically, regardless of echo achlaut. Diphthongs were also broken up with the palatal approximant or labial approximant, and there were some examples of metathesis as well. However, these changes were not just limited to phonology. The IßiQuatscha also dramatically simplified German grammar, with distinctions between strong and weak verb inflections disappearing. Conjugation for person and number also disappeared, with all verbs now being based on the first person singular form. There was also some isiXhosa influence on the language's inflection morphology. With the past tense, for example, the perfective aspect became the default way of marking the past tense, and the auxiliary verbs ham, sein were both dropped, and there was the suffix le added from isiXhosa ile. With negation, a new prefix a was also added from isiXhosa, both of which being examples of how isiXhosa influence slowly started to blend itself more and more into the language. However, the development of Quatcha did not stop following this initial phase of colonization. Like in the much larger South Africa, the German colony of Southeast Africa implemented a system of racial segregation upon gaining independence as the Khai Republic. This system entrenched the already established racial hierarchy, with European settlers at the top and indigenous IßiQhosa at the bottom. Laws were put in place restricting the political, social, and economic freedoms of the IßiQhosa, which were of course met with resistance. One of these forms was linguistic. Some within the small Xhosa intellectual circles of the mid-1900s became interested in the works of Karl Marx and his idea of class struggle. Alongside invigorating a new communist strand of anti-apartheid resistance, some had the idea of using language as a means of countering German segregationist propaganda, which portrayed the Khai Republic as a tolerant and diverse nation made up of separate but equal peoples. these intellectuals drew inspiration from their native isiXhosa, a language with many noun classes, to create a system of linguistic class struggle in order to point out the fact that no, the Khmer Republic was based on a system of unequal racial segregation. To achieve that, these intellectuals added the isiXhosa noun class prefixes onto their German equivalents and created a new system to help adjectives agree with their complement in noun class. These noun classes were then placed in a hierarchy of agency, and a new system developed to show how these classes were in conflict with one another. So before every transitive clause, there was an introductory phrase which established the hierarchy and relationship between the verb's two complements. The noun with more agency, also known as the primary aspect, came first and was then marked with a suffix denoting its gender and its role as the primary aspect. Then there was the particle ge, showing that the two nouns are in conflict with one another, and lastly the secondary aspect. This initial relationship could then play out in a series of different class struggle conditions. Condition 1 was annihilation, where the secondary aspect was destroyed or subsumed into the primary aspect, such as in the example umana eyese fuya infituchanta. The suffix fuya on the verb eyese shows that the action is in favor of the primary aspect umana, and then the particle tuchanta shows that the hierarchy established in the introductory phrase has remained the same. Because it's annihilation and the secondary aspect infi is destroyed, only umana heya remains in the concluding phrase, which shows what the contradiction is like after the conflict has occurred. Condition 2 is where the status quo is maintained, and essentially the relationship between the two nouns does not change between the introductory phrase and the concluding phrase. Here again, the verb is marked with the suffix fuya, showing that it's in favor of the primary aspect, and then there is the particle tuchanta, again showing the hierarchy and relationship between the two nouns remains the same. Condition 3 is revolution, where the secondary aspect gains agency and becomes the primary aspect. Such as in this example, umana eyang qia fa gege infi amanla. This time the verb is marked with the suffix gege, which shows that the verb is acting against the interests of the primary aspect. The particle amanla shows that the hierarchy within the contradiction has reversed itself, and that's reflected in the concluding phrase where infi is now the primary aspect. This is the closest thing that IßiQuatscha has to a passive voice, because despite umana being the subject syntactically, in fact infi is the agent of this verb, of this sentence, because it is the thing that is attacking the man. Condition 4 is crisis, where both aspects of the contradiction are harmed and ultimately destroyed. In this example, umana eya chi kagege au infi kriza. Again, gege showing that it's against the interests of the primary aspect as well as the secondary aspect in this example. And then there is the particle kriza showing that there is the crisis condition. And in this example, there is no concluding phrase because both aspects of the contradiction are destroyed, and therefore the relationship ceases to exist. The final condition is a mutually beneficial one where the conflict is ultimately resolved and both aspects benefit and are made equal. Again, the verb is marked with the suffix fuya in the example umana ekuka fuya infi ubuntu, and then there's the particle ubuntu, which shows that the conflict has now been resolved, and in the concluding phrase there is no primary aspect marking, it's just two nouns contrasted side by side with one another. There is no particle ge to show that they're in conflict, and both are ultimately now just equal. In longer utterances or stories, speakers began to differentiate between primary and secondary conflicts. The primary one was introduced in the beginning with an introductory phrase and then again at the end with its concluding phrase. However, the secondary conflicts would arise each time a new noun is introduced in a transitive phrase with its accompanying introductory clause, but it did not have a concluding phrase like the primary contradiction did. However, in some cases, the verb in a sentence would affect the primary and secondary conflicts in different ways, leading to the phenomenon of compound conditions, where the Particles for describing the contradictions were combined to create a more nuanced explanation of how a particular sentence is affecting the class structure. By the time that racial segregation had ended in the Khmer Republic and it became the IßiQuatscha People's Republic, IßiQuatscha had morphed from the language purely of resistance to the language of the youth. Many of the revolutionaries began to pass on the language to their descendants, and with it came many new features from isiXhosa, such as moving adjectives after nouns and the proliferation of many new loanwords. There was also a new verb conjugation system where subject pronouns were prefixed onto verbs, and there were many new cases such as the associative marked with the prefix un, the prepositional with the prefix nga, the locative with the circumflex e, ni, and the copulative marked with the infix bin. Now the language has firmly cemented itself into the fabric of IßiQuatscha society and is the home language of around 10% of the population, primarily concentrated in urban areas such as Bisho, Beja, and Cuenca. And this is the language that the Cultural Commission has now decided to recognize. Inshalanga fachauge inshalanga. Inshalanga indisa eben maetse tisha tsuchanta. Ayeveya veba zosifuya nizihali elontilikai vebe chuluni. Oda ayeveya kringela zosifuya ni echata ukuhoyini. Nuko vida gobuyata kentolosa kira tsuchanta o tika. Amakifa bage infalai, amakifa inzaini zizishlisa fugege, efalaini inaigana, inzaini zukriza. Amatsana bage umshwanza, amatsana zicheha fugege tsifa umshwanzi, maigana muzaini zukriza. Inshalanga farauge amankohene, eya anagege amankohene amazaini, ala opo zigebin saeti ripale kriza. Inshalanga farauge ukiabi. Etichinka gege kiabi muzaini. Ala opo gapshe pale fuya ievikaiti kriza. Ititeya ebin aufechesa ebin fayashalunga baida. Imeko bage ukegefiliteya imeko ukugefiliteya kuzaini. Eshulanka gege ukugefiliteya kriza. Umshoanza fechesa umshiliteya. Inshalanga ebin tetamente zihali eseyunga bohohene kala gelite itzaiti zaini. Inshalanga ikringela fuya yetse unfuya ima hetseni in maini unvelete in zaini tsuchanta. Inshalanga fachau. And now on to our next story, the explosion in seagull populations and subsequent rise in fish prices.